getting set up on YouTube right now. I believe it should be working. So, good morning and welcome to episode 2 of The Daily Grind, where we're going to be going into backward thinking a little bit. So, in episode 1, what I covered was the fact that anytime we're coming into a new year, it's a habit of ours to come up with a bunch of different New Year's resolutions and to have this expectation for ourselves that somehow just by willing our behavior into existence that we're all of a sudden going to change everything that we couldn't change the year before. And while this is a good hope, it's a great aspiration, it just doesn't seem like something that's very likely. To me, what I notice is that's a lot like treating the symptoms when you haven't ever taken a look at the cause underneath. And maybe behavior modification isn't the answer. Maybe the answer is examining what we've learned growing up, how we've processed data, what trauma we've been through, and how are we going to do it differently in the future when we come to that same moment of a tough decision or a moment of tragedy in our life. Are we going to react by thinking the same way that we did before? If that's true, maybe one or two attempts or a week's worth of attempts or a month's worth of attempts could go differently, right? But eventually, without changing the underlying way of thinking, at least from my experience, it's been a habit where I've slipped back into old patterns. And so, what I'm suggesting is that this year, I know I'm going to, and I hope that you'll do so as well, that we take a little more time to focus on the causes of our thinking. Maybe we're not even trying to operate with the right tools. That was another thing I was guilty of. I was reacting based on my gut, what I felt, my emotions, and allowing those to dictate the direction of my choices. And while sometimes this works out, obviously it gets us to the next moment. It's not always the most rational decision. In fact, a lot of time it's quite the opposite. And so I wrote a book series called the Burden of Proof book series. And you can look it up at burdenofproof.co. On the shop page, we have a couple of different books. So the first one, The Flaw, is available for free right now. So you can go ahead and download it. And I want you to use this as a test material. See if it's something that's for you. And because sometimes fiction isn't for everybody. Actually, before I wrote this, I would have said fiction really wasn't even for me. When I started to write this series, my goal was to introduce this new way of thinking that I'm talking about, kind of walk through a step progression to try to find what the truth is. And weirdly enough, the new way of thinking kind of found me. And as I went along, it it corrected the way in which I was thinking about things, the way that I was doing things. And it allowed me to, I guess, experience things through the character Marcus in the story that I hadn't really fully lived out or thought about in my own life. And I think that's going to be true for many of the people who read the book. They're going to find the characters Marcus and Sarah to be, at a minimum, relatable, but almost in a way we could live sort of vicariously through their characters to play out situations that we left unfinished, traumas that we went through but we were unwilling to confront at the time. I know that it has helped me with that. So what I wanted to do today is I wanted to pull up a chapter from the first book, The Flaw. and I wanted to read it to y'all and maybe just have a discussion about it. And I'm not exactly sure what we'll get into, but let's give it a try. It's chapter 4 of Burden of Proof, the Flaw. And once again, you can look that up at burdenofproof.co on the shop page. So Marcus sat on the floor of the hallway, staring at the hole in the ceiling. Plaster dust covered his clothes. Water dripped from exposed beams. And somewhere in his mind a question was forming, one he couldn't ignore anymore. How did I get here? Not the hallway, not the house, but here. This moment where everything he'd built had fallen apart. He thought about the leak behind the washing machine. He'd seen it, known it was a problem, and done nothing. Then the water spot on the ceiling, walked past it every day, watched it grow, still did nothing. And now this. The ceiling had caved in because he'd ignored the signs until it was too late. But the house wasn't the real problem, was it? Marcus stood slowly, walked to the living room, and sat on the couch. The same couch where he'd spent the last 3 months rebuilding his life, or thinking he had. He pulled out his phone. His hands were still shaking, but not as badly now. The urge to walk to the bar was still there, gnawing at him, but something else had broken through. A realization. I've been doing this my whole life. Not with houses, with everything. He'd ignored the signs that his drinking was a problem until he'd flunked out of school. Ignored the warning signs in his relationships until people left. Ignored his dad's quiet concern until it was too late to say the things that mattered. And now he was about to do it again. Walk to that bar, ignore every reason he'd gotten sober, and pretend it would somehow fix the emptiness in his chest. Marcus leaned back against the couch. I can't fix this house if I don't understand what's broken. And I can't fix myself if I don't understand how I got here. He thought about his dad, about the things they'd never talked about, the beliefs Marcus had inherited without ever questioning them, the assumptions he built his life on. What if all of it, the drinking, the failures, the chaos, what if it wasn't just bad luck or weakness? What if the way he thought about things had been broken from the start? Marcus opened his laptop. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he knew he needed to understand something, anything, about how thinking was supposed to work. Because right now, his thinking had led him to a hole in the ceiling and a near walk to the bar. And that wasn't working. So, as I was writing this passage, and maybe one day we'll go into what parts of the story are reality versus what parts of the story are aspects meant to increase the narrative, but the point holds true that sometimes it takes these moments, as much as we hate them when they're happening, as much as they're deeply painful, it takes a lot of times, it takes a moment like that. And we didn't even go into all the details of what actually happened to Marcus to get to that point. But it takes a moment of extreme loss, extreme tragedy, before we can even recognize that we never really learned how to think. So when you're growing up, not only is it something you do by accident, and something that's all right to inherit the beliefs of those around you, especially when it comes to your parents or your friends. But what we don't realize is that it's also necessary. There are certain things we just don't know, and we have no other method by which to learn them at a young age than through those family members or friends I was just talking about. Things like not running out into the street, things like not touching the stove, things that really actually physically or mentally endanger you. The thing is, their knowledge is limited too. And while some parents know more than others, some friends know more than others, not everything that they teach you is going to line up with reality. And as we get older, we run smack into that situation, whether it be a belief system, a way that we should think about things, what we should buy, what career we should do, where we should go to get an education, and so on. Regardless of what it is, we're going to come to a point where what we've been taught doesn't fully line up with reality. And what do we do at that point? If you're anything like Marcus, if you're anything like me, when confronted head on with a reality that I wasn't ready to face, that he wasn't ready to face, the solution was to ignore. Not because I actually thought ignoring the situation was going to do anything to help, but because I thought maybe at a later point I was going to be more ready to process it, more ready to handle the situation. And I'm not sure that my mentality on that ever entirely changed. It was more like you get to this cracking point, right where Marcus is sitting, where the physical house has collapsed. It doesn't have to be physical in your scenario, but along with everything around him, it didn't just rain, it poured. His entire life collapsed. And at that moment, you got two choices. You can run to the quick fixes or the patch jobs that you've always tried to apply, even knowing that they've never worked before, knowing that they're not even going to work now, but maybe it'll help you to just ignore the problem a little while longer. And sometimes that's all we can do. I know for me, there's been points in my life where I wasn't able to actually work at trying to fix my thinking or fix my problems. I was just too broken. And it seemed like that was always the moment for me when things stacked up even more. And there's probably a correlation there, not just to the fact that it all happened at once, but to the fact that me ignoring some of those problems allowed them to build up. And looking at it now, it seems like, oh, it would have been easy to accomplish these two things and this thing over here. And hang on just one moment. I got something touching the heater over here. As I was saying, it would have been easy to pick these things apart and decide what decisions that I would make in hindsight. But in that moment, it was like I couldn't even decide if it was worth making the next decision. And I was so trapped by that. But when we do get to this moment, you got two choices. You can either return to the ignorance or the willful, I guess, choosing not to focus on what can actually be done because you're not ready, because you don't want to, or you can choose to start making a change. At that point in life, like I said, I started trying to change the behaviors. And time and time again, I slipped back into the old behaviors, into the old habits. And I had already most assuredly done that beforehand as well, before the collapse moment in my life. But this moment is a moment where we recognize that what we've been taught doesn't line up, and what are you going to do from here? Are you going to revert to the beliefs that you've been taught? Are you going to test those beliefs? And if you're going to test them, how will you test them? What tools are at your disposal for doing so? Because that was another thing with the beliefs that I had inherited. And it wasn't that they were necessarily wrong, it was just that I didn't know. And what I found, what I've mentioned multiple times recently, is that we're handed a book about science, we're handed a book about math, we're handed a book about religion. But what they don't hand you is a method by which to test to see if anything that they've told you, any book that they've given you, is actually true. It's like you're just supposed to accept it and move on, and not even that, you're supposed to give that answer back to them. In fact, that's what we're trained to do in our schools, is to give the same answer back to them that they gave to us. And if you tried to give a different answer, you probably wouldn't do so well in school. But ultimately, he recognizes that he's had all these assumptions that he built his life on. Assumptions about his dad, assumptions about his drinking, assumptions about his relationships. And he never really deeply looked for evidence of where he could be doing better or where his thinking might be in the wrong. And so all of these things fell apart a little at a time, but it wasn't those moments when he noticed it. It wasn't until much later that he finds out that the assumptions have been there the whole time and none of them have been verified. Because you can't verify something you don't know how to test. And another phrase I've been thinking about a lot lately, if you haven't tested your beliefs, they're not really your beliefs. They belong to the person you inherited them from. And who knows if they ever tested those beliefs? How long or how far each belief goes back? Some could probably be traced. I don't know if that's worth the time and effort to look into. Maybe it is for you. But that doesn't change what we do right now. Right now, the question, are you going to test those beliefs that are colliding with reality right now and just don't match up? Or are you going to hold fast to something that's not real, something that's not true, something that you have recognized doesn't line up? And this is not to criticize, because I have most surely been guilty of doing that. This is so that you can understand that you're not alone in feeling that way. What you're seeing is likely true, and choosing to examine it, it isn't a betrayal to those friends or to that family or to your religion or to your identity that you've built to examine these things, because truth, if it exists, it won't fail under scrutiny. It doesn't just fall apart. What falls apart is deception. What falls apart is things that don't line up with reality. And I hope that for those of you who are listening to this now or are listening to this later, that you're willing to take that risk and start to examine these concepts. As we get into later episodes, we'll start talking about the process of backward thinking and how this is something that Marcus has done without even realizing, and what that really means and how it affects your decision making and your day-to-day life, because it prevents you from being able to properly assess the decisions right in front of you. It keeps you relying on your own bias to try to create the world around you to match what you think it should be based on what others told you it should be, rather than seeing the world for what it is. And if you hang with me long enough, we'll start talking about some of those exact tools in the next couple of weeks that can help us to actually assess and test the different beliefs that we've been taught, the different ways of thinking, the different behaviors, to see what doesn't match so we can learn to seek truth and seek clarity. Because if not, what's it all for? If we're not trying to find purpose, maybe somebody out there is okay with that. And if I got to the end of this journey and found out that there was no real purpose, that it all just collided together and it's all just essentially an inevitable accident, at least then I would know. But if I never pursued it, that thought is one that doesn't make any sense to me at all. Because if I find out there is a truth, then I can find out potentially what that purpose is or what my purpose is. If I find out there isn't a truth, at least I have an answer, and I'm not striving my entire life at meaningless goals when I should just be, doing whatever I think I want right now. Because if there's no purpose, and what I think I want, when I say what I think I want, it doesn't mean that's what I actually want. It just means why not just act on every impulse? Why not just go with everything that pops into your head that could potentially make you happy? Why do we take the time to rationalize? Why do we take the time to see the course of where it might lead if ultimately it has no purpose? And there's some people who will talk about, well, the purpose is, future generations. Okay. I agree that's definitely a purpose we can find within ourselves, but what's up with the common humanity as a whole seeming to seek this purpose, whatever that purpose may be? If the truth exists, can anyone honestly say to themselves that that's not worth pursuing, that that's not worth understanding, that there's something more important in their day going on today or first thing in the morning tomorrow than seeking that truth and learning how to test what they've believed and being willing to do the work in order to find out what they want from this life, what they really want, not their impulses. Because I've been taught, not intentionally, maybe I just picked it up. Let me rephrase. Maybe I just picked up along the way that somehow there's this difference between like what you believe and what is rational, and there's this category of separation between the two. But how would it make any sense for us to go on believing things that are irrational? And do we have a rational mind? Or, as some might suggest, is it just the natural selection taking its work, and this brain is just the result of survivability, what suits us best? Is that what's most likely? And today isn't a day of answers. Today is a day of questions. Today is a day of exposing that there are flaws in the first place. For me, today is a day of hope. A hope that together we can take this journey and find out whether there is an objective truth, whether there is a way to test and see if it can be found. And a willingness to do so in such a way that we've recognized that everything's not going to hold up. It sure hasn't for me. And being okay with that, because ultimately, that's just another crack in an illusion that doesn't exist. If it doesn't line up with reality, it's not worth believing. At least not for me. And that hope is that this is something we can come together on. Not because at the end we will all end up with the same result necessarily. In fact, it's quite possible that along the way, you may not agree with one of the logical tools that I come up with. You may not agree with the step I used using those tools. But the purpose of it is I want you to disagree when you don't feel like I've lined up with this search for truth, with this intent, so that I can reassess again. Because, as I said before, the ultimate goal isn't being right here. The ultimate goal is finding truth, even if it's in a place that's uncomfortable, even if it overturns things that I had set up as my identity, things that I needed to be true. Because I know that there's nothing in this life more important than truth, and no asset greater that we have than time. And so why wouldn't we spend that time in that search? So I hope that y'all will join me tomorrow. I'm going to try for 6:30 a.m. This morning it was a little bit later, about 6:45. To do the next episode. As I said, we'll probably discuss a little bit more about backward thinking, maybe read another passage from the book, and we will take it from there and kind of see where it leads. But until next time, test everything and hold fast to what is true.